June 12, 1945. Camp Swift, Texas. The transport truck rattled to a stop outside the wooden gates, kicking up a cloud of red dust that hung in the thick summer air. Inside, 23 German women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms damp with sweat, their faces masks of exhaustion and uncertainty. They had traveled for 6 weeks across the Atlantic, then by rail through a country so vast it seemed impossible, finally arriving at this place that felt like the edge of the world. 26-year-old Greta Mueller pressed her face against the small window, squinting at the landscape beyond. Endless flat land stretched to the horizon, broken only by scattered oak trees and the shimmering heat waves rising from the earth. Nothing like the rolling hills of Bavaria she had left behind 3 years ago when she joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps. Nothing like the France where she had been captured just 2 months earlier as the Reich crumbled around them. The truck's back gate swung open with a metallic screech. Harsh sunlight flooded in, momentarily blinding them. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the brightness, and Greta instinctively straightened her posture, preparing for whatever American cruelty awaited them. She had heard stories about prisoner of war camps, about hard labor and insufficient food, about guards who saw them as nothing more than the enemy. But the voice that called out to them carried an accent Greta had never heard before, drawling and almost musical in its cadence. "Y'all step on out now, nice and easy. Ain't nobody gonna hurt you here." The women climbed down slowly, their legs stiff from the long journey. Greta counted 6 guards waiting for them, all men in their 30s and 40s wearing the uniform of the United States Army, but something about them seemed different from the soldiers she had encountered during her capture. These men looked like they had spent more time on horseback than in military formation. Several wore worn cowboy boots beneath their regulation pants, and one even had a battered Stetson hat pushed back on his head. The tall guard who had spoken stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal sun-weathered features and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Name's Buck Thompson," he said slowly, gesturing as he spoke. "I know most of y'all don't speak much English, but we'll figure it out." He turned to gesture at the compound behind him. Simple wooden barracks surrounded a dusty yard with a larger building at the center. "This here's gonna be your home for a while. It ain't the Ritz, but it's clean and it's safe." Greta glanced at her fellow prisoners. Confusion flickered across their faces. This wasn't what they had expected. Where was the hostility? Where were the harsh commands and threatening postures? Buck Thompson smiled and called out something that would change everything. "Y'all Nazi gals hungry? We got supper waiting." The story of how these 23 German women arrived in the heart of Texas began 3 months earlier, in the chaos of a collapsing Reich. Greta had been stationed at a communications facility outside Lyon, France, monitoring radio transmissions and decoding messages for Wehrmacht officers who grew more desperate with each passing day. She had joined the auxiliary in 1942, 19 years old, and full of conviction that she was defending her homeland against enemies who threatened everything she knew. Her father, a schoolteacher in Munich, had been cautiously supportive. Her mother had cried but understood that young women across Germany were being called to serve in whatever capacity they could. Greta had been assigned to communications because of her quick mind and steady hands, spending long hours in windowless rooms wearing headphones, transcribing coded messages that she was forbidden to question or discuss. But by March of 1945, there was nothing left to defend. Allied forces had swept through France with overwhelming force. The communications facility received orders to evacuate, then to surrender, then no orders at all as command structure dissolved into chaos. Greta and 22 other women from various auxiliary units had been captured together by American forces near the Swiss border, processed through a temporary holding facility, and eventually designated for transport to the United States. The journey across the Atlantic had been long and frightening. The women were kept separate from male prisoners, housed in converted cargo holds with basic sanitation and minimal rations. They weren't mistreated, but they weren't shown kindness either. They were simply cargo being shipped to an uncertain destination. During those weeks at sea, Greta had plenty of time to contemplate what awaited them. Would they be put to hard labor? Would they face revenge from Americans who had lost sons and brothers to German bullets? When they finally reached American soil, the sheer scale of the country had overwhelmed them. The train journey from the East Coast to Texas had taken days, passing through landscapes that seemed impossibly diverse and abundant. Cities that showed no signs of bombing damage, farmland stretching endlessly in every direction, people who looked well-fed and confident, going about their lives as if war was something happening somewhere else entirely. Greta had pressed her face to the train window, watching this strange country roll past, feeling her understanding of the world crack and reform with each passing mile. Germany was in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its people starving and scattered. Yet here was America, untouched and thriving, so vast that the war seemed to have left no mark upon it. When they finally arrived in Texas, the heat had hit them like a physical force. The air itself felt different here, thick and weighted with moisture despite the endless sun. The landscape was alien, flat and open in ways that made Greta feel exposed and vulnerable. Everything about this place contradicted what she thought she knew about America, about her enemies, about what her future might hold. Buck Thompson hadn't expected to be guarding German prisoners when he enlisted in 1943. The 42-year-old rancher from outside Bastrop had figured he'd be too old for combat duty, but the Army needed men to staff the dozens of prisoner-of-war camps springing up across Texas. Someone had to guard the thousands of German and Italian soldiers being shipped to America, and Buck supposed he could do that job as well as anyone. He had grown up on his family's cattle ranch, learning to work with his hands and treat people fairly, lessons his mama had drilled into him since childhood. His father had taught him that a man's character showed in how he treated those who had no power over him, and Buck had carried that principle into his military service. These German women were prisoners, sure, but they were also somebody's daughters, somebody's sisters, far from home and probably scared out of their minds. The other guards at Camp Swift shared similar backgrounds. Joe Martinez had worked on a ranch near San Antonio before the war. Pete Wilson had been a rodeo rider. Tommy Chen, whose family owned a restaurant in Houston, had joined up to prove his loyalty after Pearl Harbor, despite being Chinese American. They were working men who understood hard labor and simple kindness, not career soldiers trained to see enemies everywhere. When Buck had first received word that female prisoners were being assigned to Camp Swift, he'd called a meeting with his small team. "Listen here," he'd told them. "I don't care what these women did during the war. They're in our care now, and we're going to treat them with respect. Any man who can't do that can request a transfer right now." No one had requested a transfer. The camp itself was modest compared to the larger facilities housing thousands of male prisoners across Texas. 23 women required less space and fewer guards. The barracks had been hastily converted from storage buildings, but Buck had made sure they were cleaned thoroughly and equipped with proper beds and washing facilities. He'd even convinced the quartermaster to requisition some basic amenities, things that might make the women feel less like prisoners and more like displaced persons waiting out the war's end. But it was Buck's mama, Sarah Thompson, who had really changed his thinking about how to handle this unusual assignment. When he'd mentioned during a weekend visit home that he'd be guarding German women, she'd looked at him with those sharp eyes that had kept him in line his whole life and said, "Buck Thompson, those girls are probably scared and homesick and don't know what's going to happen to them. You remember what it's like to be far from home and uncertain about everything?" He did remember. He'd spent 6 months in training in California, feeling displaced and lonely despite being in his own country. These women had traveled across an ocean to a land they'd been taught to hate, expecting harsh treatment from enemies they'd been told were monsters. So Buck had decided on a different approach. He'd start with something universal, something that transcended language and nationality. He'd start with his mama's fried chicken. The mess hall smelled like nothing Greta had ever encountered. Rich, savory, with an underlying sweetness that made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. The 23 women filed in slowly, uncertain and wary, their eyes adjusting to the dim interior after the brutal brightness outside. Long wooden tables stretched before them, and at the far end, steam rose from large metal serving trays. Buck Thompson stood near the food, that same easy smile on his weathered face. "Now, I know y'all probably had some rough travel rations these past weeks," he said, speaking slowly and clearly. "So me and the boys, we figured we'd start things off right. This here's a Texas welcome." He lifted the lid off the first tray, and Greta's breath caught. Golden brown chicken pieces, glistening with oil, piled high and still crackling faintly from the heat. The smell intensified, filling the hall with an aroma that made her mouth water despite her confusion and fear. Beside the chicken sat bowls of what looked like mashed potatoes, dark beans, and golden squares of something she didn't recognize. "Come on now, don't be shy." Buck gestured toward the serving line. "Get yourselves a plate." The women exchanged glances. Greta could see the same questions reflected in their faces. Was this a trick? Some kind of test? In the holding facilities during their journey, they'd received adequate but bland food, nothing like this feast laid before them. One woman, a thin blonde named Anna Schmidt who had served as a nurse, whispered in German, "Why would they feed us this well? What do they want from us?" But hunger won out over suspicion. One by one, the women approached the serving line. Buck and another guard, the one called Joe Martinez, served them personally, piling their plates high with food. "That's cornbread," Joe said, pointing to the golden squares. "And these are pinto beans. Real Texas eating right here." Greta accepted her plate with trembling hands, murmuring "Danke" before catching herself. The chicken was still hot enough that she had to be careful picking it up. She took a tentative bite, and her eyes widened in shock. The crispy coating shattered between her teeth, giving way to tender, juicy meat, seasoned with flavors she couldn't identify, but that seemed to sing on her tongue. It was nothing like the bland, overcooked food she'd grown accustomed to during the war years in Germany, when everything had been rationed and stretched thin. Around her, the other women were having similar reactions. Some ate slowly, savoring each bite. Others devoured their food with desperate hunger of people who had been uncertain where their next meal would come from. A few began to cry quietly, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness that contradicted everything they had been taught about their captors. Buck watched from the corner, his arms crossed but his expression satisfied. "Ain't nothing breaks down walls quite like good food," he said quietly to Joe. "My mama taught me that." That first night in the barracks, Greta lay awake on her narrow cot, staring at the wooden ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. Around her, the other women shifted restlessly in their beds, equally unable to sleep despite their exhaustion. The Texas heat pressed down on them even after sunset, thick and heavy in a way that made breathing feel like work. "They're trying to confuse us," Anna Schmidt whispered from the next bunk. "Make us weak with kindness so we'll tell them things." "What things?" Another voice responded from the darkness. It was Margarete Hoffman, a former radio operator like Greta. "The war is over. Germany has surrendered. What secrets do they think we know?" Greta rolled onto her side, her stomach still uncomfortably full from the meal. That chicken had been real, prepared with care and served with genuine hospitality. But accepting that truth meant accepting something even more difficult. It meant admitting that the Americans weren't the brutal monsters she'd been told about, which meant questioning what else she'd been told that might be lies. "My brother died fighting Americans," said a quiet voice from across the room. Greta recognized it as belonging to Elsa Braun, a 21-year-old from Dresden who rarely spoke. "In Normandy. They killed him." The words hung in the darkness like an accusation. How could they accept kindness from people who had killed their brothers, their fathers, their friends? How could they sit at tables with men who had destroyed their country? "The Americans I shot at probably had sisters, too," Greta found herself saying, surprising herself with the admission. She had never fired a weapon, but she had decoded messages that sent men to their deaths. She had been part of the machine that fed soldiers into the grinding violence of war. "We're all someone's family." "Don't," Anna said sharply. "Don't make them human. It's easier if we remember they're the enemy." But Greta couldn't unknow what she'd experienced that evening. Buck Thompson's weathered face creased with genuine concern. Joe Martinez's careful efforts to explain each dish, wanting them to understand and enjoy their food. The way none of the guards had shown hatred or cruelty, only a kind of practical hospitality that seemed as natural to them as breathing. She thought about the Germany she'd left behind, the one where food had become scarce and people had grown gray with hunger and fear. She thought about the communications facility where she'd worked, where officers had become increasingly frantic and desperate as defeat closed in. She thought about the propaganda posters she'd seen throughout the war, depicting Americans as cruel aggressors who wanted to destroy German culture and enslave German people. Then she thought about that fried chicken, cooked with care by men who could have simply thrown rations at them and walked away. Small kindnesses that cost them nothing but meant everything to women who had expected punishment and received grace instead. "I don't think it's easier," Greta whispered into the darkness. "I think it's harder, but maybe it's also true." The routine at Camp Swift settled into an unexpected rhythm over the following weeks. The women were assigned light duties, maintaining the barracks, working in the laundry, and helping in the administrative offices. But it was the kitchen that became the heart of their transformation, thanks to Buck Thompson's mother and her church friends. Sarah Thompson arrived at Camp Swift on a Sunday morning in late June, driving her old Ford pickup truck with 3 other women from the Bastrop Baptist Church. She was 72 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands weathered from decades of ranch work. When Buck had told her about the Germanwomen, she'd listened quietly, then said simply, "Bring me out there next Sunday. I'll teach them to cook proper." Buck had tried to explain that it might not be appropriate, that there were regulations about civilian contact with prisoners. His mama had fixed him with a look that had been silencing him since childhood. "Buck Thompson, those girls need women around them, not just soldiers. And everybody needs to know how to fry chicken. Now you arrange it, or I'll go over your head to the camp commander." The camp commander, Colonel Robert Hayes, had been surprisingly receptive. He was a practical man who believed that well-occupied prisoners caused fewer problems than bored ones. If teaching cooking skills kept the Germanwomen engaged and peaceful, he saw no reason to object. So on that first Sunday, Greta and 6 other women found themselves in the camp kitchen, facing Sarah Thompson and her friends. The elderly woman surveyed them with sharp but kind eyes, then rolled up her sleeves. "Right then," she said slowly, and Joe Martinez stepped forward to translate into his halting German. "We're gonna teach y'all how to make the best fried chicken in Texas, and cornbread, and biscuits too, if we got time." Greta watched, fascinated, as Sarah demonstrated the process. First came the buttermilk bath for the chicken, then the seasoned flour mixture. "Secrets in the proportions," Sarah explained, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this thousands of times. "Salt, black pepper, paprika, and just a touch of cayenne for heat. Not too much though. You want folks to taste the chicken, not just the fire." The Germanwomen gathered close, watching as Sarah heated cast iron skillets filled with lard. The explanation, of temperature, of when the oil was ready, of how to know when to flip the chicken. These weren't just cooking instructions. They were an inheritance being passed down, a tradition being shared across the divide of nationality and war. When Greta tentatively placed her first piece of chicken into the hot oil and heard it sizzle to life, something inside her shifted. Sarah stood beside her, one weathered hand resting lightly on Greta's shoulder. "That's it, honey," she said gently. "You're doing just fine." It was the first time since her capture that anyone had called her honey, had touched her with simple maternal affection. Greta felt tears prick her eyes. The letter arrived for Greta on a sweltering morning in early July. Buck Thompson brought it to her personally, his expression uncharacteristically somber. She recognized her mother's handwriting on the envelope immediately, and her hands began to shake before she even opened it. It was the first communication she'd received from home since her capture 3 months earlier. She carried it to a quiet corner of the compound, near the fence where a scraggly mesquite tree provided some shade. The letter was brief, written on paper so thin it was nearly transparent, likely salvaged from whatever supplies remained in Munich. Her mother's usually neat script was shaky, the words wandering across the page as if written by an unsteady hand. "My dearest Greta," it began, "I pray this letter finds you alive and well. We only recently learned through the Red Cross that you are a prisoner in America. Your father and I thank God you are safe, even if you are so far away." Greta's throat tightened as she read further. Munich had been bombed repeatedly in the war's final months. Their apartment building was gone, reduced to rubble in a raid that had killed 37 people in their neighborhood. Her parents were living in 2 rooms of a partially destroyed house with 3 other families, sharing whatever food they could find. Her father had lost his teaching position because of his party affiliation and now worked clearing debris from the streets for meager rations. "Your brother Klaus," the letter continued, and Greta had to stop reading, pressing the paper against her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. Klaus, her baby brother, 20 years old, and conscripted into service in the war's final desperate months. We received notification in April that he fell near Berlin. They did not return his body. We have no grave to visit, no place to say goodbye. Around the compound, other women were receiving similar letters. Anna Schmidt sat on the barrack steps, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Margaret Hoffman walked in circles, reading and rereading a letter that brought news of her entire family's death in the Dresden bombing. Elsa Brown simply stared at nothing, a letter hanging loose in her fingers, her expression blank with shock. That evening, the women gathered in the mess hall for dinner, but the usual conversations were absent. They sat in heavy silence, pushing food around their plates. The fried chicken that had seemed like such a gift just weeks ago now felt like an accusation. Their families were starving in Germany, living in ruins, mourning their dead. And here the women sat, well-fed and safe, protected by the very people who had helped destroy their homeland. Buck Thompson watched from the kitchen doorway, understanding without needing translation what had happened. He'd seen enough men receive bad news from home to recognize grief when he saw it. He wanted to offer comfort but knew that some wounds were too fresh for words from anyone, especially from former enemies. Greta looked at the food before her, then at the letter she still clutched. How could she eat when her mother was hungry? How could she accept kindness when Klaus was dead? 3 days after the letters arrived, Buck Thompson made an announcement that shocked everyone at Camp Swift. It was June 29th, and he gathered the German women in the main yard under the blazing midday sun. Joe Martinez stood beside him, ready to translate. "Ladies," Buck began, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his forehead. "Next week is the 4th of July. That's America's Independence Day, our biggest holiday. Now, Colonel Hayes and I have been talking, and we'd like to invite y'all to participate in the celebration we're having here at camp." The women exchanged confused glances. Greta felt Anna stiffen beside her. Participate in an American patriotic celebration? It seemed absurd, perhaps even cruel, given the news they'd just received from Germany. Buck continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I know y'all just got some hard news from home. I know you're grieving, and probably feeling mighty conflicted about everything. But here's the thing." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We can't change what happened in the war. We can't bring back the folks who were lost. But we can decide how we move forward from here." Joe translated carefully, and Greta watched Buck's face as he spoke. There was no triumph in his expression, no celebration of Germany's defeat. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like understanding, as if he too carried the weight of loss and knew what it meant to be caught between grief and the need to keep living. "The celebration's gonna be simple," Buck went on. "Food, some music, maybe some games if folks are feeling up to it. You don't have to come if you don't want to, but if you do, you're welcome, not as prisoners, but as guests." That evening, the women argued among themselves in the barracks. Anna was adamant that attending would be a betrayal. "How can we celebrate with them while our families suffer?" she demanded, her voice sharp with anger and pain. "Klaus is dead, Greta. Your brother is dead. And they want us to eat barbecue and wave American flags? They're not asking us to celebrate Germany's defeat," Marguerite said quietly. She had been silent since receiving her letter about Dresden, but now she looked up with hollow eyes. "They're asking us to be human for one day instead of just prisoners and enemies." Greta found herself thinking about Sarah Thompson, about the patience in the old woman's hands as she taught them to cook, about Buck's quiet kindness that never asked for gratitude or acknowledgement, about the way the guards treated them not as monsters who deserved punishment, but as people who deserved dignity. "My mother's letter," Greta said slowly, the last line. "I didn't read it aloud." She pulled the thin paper from her pocket. She wrote, "Please try to find moments of peace, even there. Klaus would want you to live, not just survive." The room fell silent. Outside, cicadas sang in the mesquite trees, and the Texas heat pressed against the windows like a living thing. "Maybe," Greta whispered, "we can honor our dead by choosing to live." The 4th of July arrived with cloudless blue skies and temperatures that climbed past 100 degrees by noon. Greta stood in front of the small mirror in the barracks, smoothing down her auxiliary uniform, now clean and mended but still obviously foreign. 14 of the 23 women had decided to attend the celebration. The others remained in the barracks, their grief too fresh, their resistance too strong. As Greta walked toward the main yard with Anna and Margarete, she found herself remembering the day she'd enlisted in the Women's Auxiliary Corps, January of 1942, standing in the recruitment office in Munich with 20 other young women, all of them believing they were answering their country's call to service. The recruiter had spoken of duty and honor, of protecting the homeland from enemies who wanted to destroy German culture. She'd believed every word. Her father, despite his quiet reservations, had helped her fill out the paperwork. Her mother had sewn identification tags into her uniforms. Klaus had been proud of his big sister, 13 years old and full of admiration for her courage. None of them had questioned the narrative they'd been given. None of them had imagined where that path would lead. The camp yard had been transformed. Long tables covered with red and white checkered cloths held platters of food, hamburgers and hot dogs, potato salad and watermelon. American flags hung from posts, snapping in the hot breeze. A gramophone played music that sounded foreign but energetic, full of brass instruments and drums. Some of the guards had brought their families, women in summer dresses and children running between the tables, their laughter bright and uncomplicated. Buck Thompson spotted them and waved them over. "Glad y'all decided to come," he said with genuine warmth. "Come on, let me introduce you to some folks." He led them to a woman about Greta's age, with dark, curly hair and a friendly smile. "This here's my niece, Mary Lou. She teaches at the elementary school in Bastrop. Mary Lou, these are some of the ladies from the camp." Mary Lou extended her hand without hesitation. "Pleased to meet you," she said slowly and clearly. "Uncle Buck told me you've been learning to cook. Said you made some mighty fine biscuits last week." Greta shook her hand, feeling the warmth of genuine welcome in the gesture. "Thank you," she managed in careful English. "Your uncle. He is very kind to us." "That's just how he is," Mary Lou said with affection. "Can't help but take care of folks. It's the ranch life, I suppose. You learn to look after things." As the afternoon progressed, Greta found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't thought possible. Mary Lou stayed close, her patience with Greta's limited English never wavering. She explained American customs, translated jokes, and included Greta in conversations with other guests as if there was nothing unusual about a German prisoner attending an Independence Day celebration. When the sun began to set and someone lit sparklers for the children, Greta watched the golden sparks cascade through the darkening air and felt something shift deep inside her chest. 2 weeks after the 4th of July celebration, Greta approached Buck Thompson with a request that surprised even herself. She'd rehearsed the words in English dozens of times, practicing with Margarete and Anna until she felt confident enough to speak. "Mr. Buck," she began, her accent still heavy but her words clear, "we would like to learn, please. The chicken recipe, the real one. Your mother's recipe." Buck looked up from the maintenance report he'd been reading, his weathered face breaking into a slow smile. "You want Mama's secret recipe? Well now, that's a serious request. That recipe's been in our family for 3 generations." Greta nodded earnestly. "We know it is special. This is why we ask. We want to learn it correctly, with respect." What Greta didn't say, what she could barely articulate even to herself, was that learning this recipe felt like learning a language of belonging. Each time Sarah Thompson visited, each cooking lesson in the camp kitchen, Greta felt less like a prisoner and more like a student being initiated into something valuable and enduring. The recipes weren't just about food, they were about connection, about being trusted with something precious. Buck studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll talk to Mama, but I warn you, she takes her cooking serious. If she agrees to teach you the real recipe, you better be ready to learn it proper." The following Sunday, Sarah Thompson arrived at Camp Swift with an extra bag of supplies and a determined expression. She'd brought her own cast-iron skillet, seasoned from decades of use, its surface as black and smooth as polished stone. 8 German women gathered in the kitchen, Greta among them, waiting with anticipation that felt almost reverent. "Now listen here," Sarah began, and Joe, Martinez translated with careful attention. "This recipe came from my grandmother, who learned it from her mother. It's been feeding Thompson family gatherings since before Texas was even a state. I don't share it with just anybody." She paused, her sharp eyes moving from face to face. "But Buck tells me you girls have been working hard, learning respectfully." says you're trying to become better than you were. That means something to me." She set her worn recipe card on the counter. "So I'm gonna trust you with something my family holds dear. But you gotta promise me you'll treat it with the honor it deserves." Greta felt tears prick her eyes. "We promise," she said in English. And the other women echoed her in German. Sarah smiled, a gentle expression that transformed her weathered features. "All right then. First thing you need to understand is that good fried chicken starts the night before. You can't rush it. You got to let the chicken soak in buttermilk with salt and hot sauce for at least 12 hours. That's what makes it tender and gives it that tang." She pulled out a bottle of buttermilk and a small jar of hot sauce. Now, the proportions matter. August arrived with news that repatriation procedures were beginning for German prisoners across the United States. Male prisoners were being processed through camps and prepared for transport back to Europe. At Camp Swift, Colonel Hayes received orders regarding the 23 women under his command. Transport would be arranged within 6 weeks. The announcement came during evening assembly. The women stood in neat rows in the main yard, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Colonel Hayes read the official orders in his formal military voice, and Joe Martinez translated into German. "All German nationals currently held at this facility will be repatriated to occupied Germany no later than September 30th, 1945. Processing will begin immediately." Greta felt her stomach drop. 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, she would board a ship and return to the ruins of Munich, to a city she no longer recognized, to a country that had become a stranger to her. She would leave behind the kitchen where she'd learned to make perfect fried chicken, the friends she'd made among the guards and their families, the version of herself she'd been slowly becoming. That night, the barracks erupted in conversation that lasted until dawn. Some women felt relief at the prospect of finally going home, of ending their captivity and returning to whatever remained of their families. Others felt nothing but dread. "What home?" Anna asked, her voice hollow. "My parents are dead, my sister is missing, Hamburg is rubble. What exactly am I returning to?" Margarete sat on her bunk, staring at the letter she'd received from a distant cousin the week before. "He says Dresden is unrecognizable. The entire city center is gone. People are living in cellars and bombed-out buildings. There's no work, barely any food. The occupation forces control everything." "But it's still Germany," Elsa argued. "It's still our country. We can't just abandon it because things are hard. Can't we?" The question came from Greta, surprising everyone, including herself. "What is Germany now? The country we serve doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it never existed the way we thought it did." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Greta thought about the concentration camp photographs they'd seen in American newspapers, about the testimonies of survivors that contradicted everything they'd believed about their homeland. She thought about the propaganda that had shaped their youth, the lies they'd been told, and the lies they'd told themselves. "Here," Greta continued, her voice gaining strength, "I've learned what I could have been if I'd been born somewhere else. Someone who questions instead of just following. Someone who thinks instead of just obeying. In Germany I was a good soldier. Here, I'm learning to be a good person. I'm not sure I want to go back to being what I was." Anna looked at her with shock and something that might have been recognition. "Are you saying you want to stay? Stay here, in enemy territory, as a prisoner?" Greta met her gaze steadily. "I'm saying that maybe our enemies understand freedom better than we ever did." For 2 weeks, Greta wrestled with the decision that seemed impossible and inevitable in equal measure. She walked the perimeter of the camp each evening, her mind churning through arguments for and against, her heart pulling in directions that contradicted everything she'd been raised to believe about duty and loyalty. Mary Lou visited twice during those weeks, bringing books in English to help Greta improve her language skills. During one visit, sitting under the mesquite tree that had become Greta's thinking spot, Mary Lou asked the question that had been hovering between them. "He would do us. What will you do when you go back?" Greta looked at the young teacher, this woman who had shown her kindness without obligation, friendship without condition. "I don't know," she admitted. "There is nothing there for me now. No family home. No job. My teaching certificate is worthless because I worked for the auxiliary. I will be just another displaced person in a country of displaced people." "What if you didn't go back?" Mary Lou asked quietly. The words were simple, but they opened a door Greta had been afraid to walk through. Is that possible? I don't know, Mary Lou said honestly, but Uncle Buck says you're the hardest worker he's ever seen. Says you've learned more English in 3 months than most folks learn in 3 years. And Aunt Sarah tells everyone in church about how you perfected her fried chicken recipe. She paused, then added, Seems to me like Texas could use someone like you. That evening, Greta called a meeting with the women who had become her closest friends. Anna, Margarete, and 5 others gathered in a quiet corner of the barracks after lights out. They spoke in whispers, their voices barely audible above the cicadas singing outside. I'm going to ask if I can stay, Greta said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. I know it sounds crazy. I know there are probably laws against it. But I have to try. Anna was quiet for a long moment. If you're crazy, then I am too, she finally said, because I've been thinking the same thing. One by one, the others admitted they'd been harboring the same impossible hope. They were 8 women bound by a shared transformation, by the discovery that the enemy they'd been taught to hate had shown them more humanity than their own government ever had. We'll do it together, Margarete said firmly. We'll make the request formally. The worst they can do is say no and send us back as planned. But Greta knew the worst outcome was actually more complicated than that. If they made this request and it became public knowledge, they would be labeled traitors by other Germans. They would be cutting themselves off from any possibility of returning home with dignity. They would be choosing exile and uncertainty over the known, however harsh that known might be. Tomorrow, Greta said, we'll speak to Colonel Hayes tomorrow. The 8 women clasped hands in the darkness, drawing strength from their shared courage and their shared fear. Colonel Hayes sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable as Greta finished explaining their request. Buck Thompson stood near the window, his hat in his hands, having insisted on being present for the meeting. The 8 women stood in a nervous line, their military bearing from years of service unable to completely hide their anxiety. Let me make sure I understand, Colonel Hayes said slowly. You're requesting permission to remain in the United States rather than accept repatriation to Germany. You understand this is unprecedented? That I don't even know if it's legally possible? Yes, sir, Greta replied in her careful English. We understand, but we must try. The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying them with the same analytical gaze he'd used to assess countless military situations. Why? Help me understand why you'd choose to stay in a country that was your enemy, far from everything you've ever known. Greta had prepared for this question, had rehearsed her answer, but now the rehearsed words seemed inadequate. She spoke from her heart instead. In Germany, I was taught that to be good citizen means to obey without question. Here, I learned that to be good person means to think, to choose, to take responsibility for my own actions. I cannot go back to being someone who only obeys. Anna stepped forward. Our families are dead or scattered. Our cities are ruins. But more than this, we learn here that everything we believed was built on lies. We cannot pretend we do not know this now. We cannot return and be silent about what we know. Colonel Hayes was silent for a long moment. I'll need to contact the War Department. This decision is well above my authority. But I'll be honest with you, ladies. Even if Washington approves, you'll face significant challenges. The American public may not be ready to welcome former enemy soldiers into their communities. He was right. Within days of the colonel sending his inquiry to Washington, word leaked to the local newspapers. The Bastrop Advertiser ran the story on its front page with the headline, "German prisoners seek to remain in Texas." The response was immediate and divided. At the Baptist church the following Sunday, Sarah Thompson found herself at the center of a heated debate. Martha Henley, whose son had been killed at Normandy, stood during the fellowship hour and spoke with barely controlled anger. How can you support this, Sarah? These women served Hitler. They were part of the machine that killed our boys. And now they want to stay here, in our town, like nothing happened? Sarah met her, gaze with compassion but firmness. Martha, I know your grief. I can't imagine losing a child. But these girls weren't the ones who killed Jimmy. They were clerks and radio operators and nurses, caught up in something bigger than they understood, and they're trying to become better than they were. That doesn't erase what they were part of, Martha insisted, her voice breaking. No, it doesn't, Sarah agreed. The debate raged through Bastrop and the surrounding communities for 3 weeks while Washington deliberated on Colonel Hayes's unprecedented request. Letters poured into the local newspaper, some calling for the women to be sent back immediately, others arguing that America should demonstrate the mercy and opportunity that set it apart from the tyranny they'd fought against. The response from Washington finally arrived in mid-September, just 2 weeks before the scheduled repatriation date. Colonel Hayes called Greta and the 7 other women to his office, Buck Thompson again present. The colonel's expression was carefully neutral as he opened the official correspondence. The War Department has determined that while they cannot prevent repatriation of prisoners who wish to return, they can reclassify prisoners as displaced persons if certain conditions are met. He looked up at the women. Those conditions include finding American sponsors willing to provide housing and assistance, securing employment, and demonstrating what they call genuine transformation and commitment to American democratic values. Greta felt her knees weaken with relief and terror in equal measure. It was possible. Difficult and uncertain, but possible. However, the colonel continued, you should understand what this means. You'll no longer be prisoners of war under military protection. You'll be civilian immigrants in a country where many people will see you as former enemies. You'll need to build entirely new lives from nothing, with no guarantee of acceptance or success. We understand, sir, Greta said, speaking for all of them. We choose this. Buck Thompson cleared his throat. Colonel, if I may, I've already spoken with my mama and with Mary Lou. The Thompson family would like to sponsor Miss Muller. We got work for her on the ranch, and Mary Lou's got a spare room in her house in town. Greta turned to Buck with shock and gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her composure. You would do this? For me? Your family already, Buck said simply. Mama doesn't teach her secret recipes to just anybody, and Mary Lou talks about you like you're her sister. Far as the Thompsons are concerned, you've already earned your place. Over the next week, other sponsors emerged from unexpected places. Dr. William Harrison from Bastrop Hospital offered to sponsor Anna, impressed by reports of her medical skills and dedication. He would employ her as a nursing assistant while she worked toward certification. The Mueller family, owners of a local bakery and themselves German immigrants from 2 generations prior, offered to sponsor Margaretti. One by one, local families stepped forward, moved by the women's story and their obvious sincerity. Not all of Bastrop supported the decision. Martha Henley and several others organized a petition against allowing the women to remain. But enough voices spoke in favor that each of the 8 women found sponsors willing to vouch for them and help them build new lives. The process required mountains of paperwork, interviews with immigration officials, and security clearances that seemed to take forever. But through it all, the women persevered, driven by the knowledge that they were choosing their own futures rather than having futures chosen for them. September 28, 1945. 2 days before the scheduled repatriation, Camp Swift held a farewell dinner unlike any in the history of American prisoner of war operations. The 15 women who had chosen to return to Germany would leave in the morning. The 8 who were staying had completed their paperwork and would be released into the custody of their sponsors the following week. The mess hall had been transformed for the occasion. Sarah Thompson had insisted on preparing the meal herself, with help from both groups of women. Long tables were covered with dishes that represented the past months of transformation. Fried chicken, golden and perfect, sat alongside German potato salad that Elsa had taught them to make. Cornbread shared space with dark rye bread. Apple pie competed with Black Forest cake. Buck Thompson stood to address the gathering, his voice thick with emotion. When these ladies first arrived here back in June, I'll admit I didn't know what to expect. I figured we'd just be counting days until they went home. I never imagined we'd be standing here today, saying goodbye to friends. He paused, looking at each woman in turn. Some of y'all are heading back to Germany to rebuild your country. That takes courage, and I admire it. Others are staying here to build new lives. That takes courage too. Either way, you're not the same people who stepped off that transport truck 4 months ago, and I'd like to think we're not the same either. Greta rose next, her English now confident enough to speak without translation. When we came here, we believed you were our enemies. We expected punishment and cruelty, because that is what we were told Americans were. Instead, you showed us kindness. You taught us your recipes, shared your traditions, treated us like human beings instead of like prisoners." Her voice wavered slightly. "You gave us something more precious than freedom. You gave us the chance to choose who we want to become. Some of us choose to take that lesson back to Germany, others choose to stay here and live it, but all of us will carry it forever." Anna stood, speaking for those returning home. "We go back not as defeated soldiers, but as ambassadors of what we have learned here. We will tell people in Germany that Americans are not monsters, that peace is possible, that former enemies can become friends. This is the gift we carry home with you." The evening continued with stories and laughter, with tears and promises to write. Sarah Thompson brought out her famous fried chicken one last time, and the women who had mastered the recipe served it alongside those who had taught it to them. The barriers of nationality and former enmity had dissolved completely, leaving only people who had shared something profound and transformative. As the night drew to a close, the women exchanged addresses and small gifts. Greta gave each of the departing women a handwritten copy of Sarah's chicken recipe, carefully transcribed in both English and German. "So you can share it," she said. "So you can teach others what we learned here. That food brings people together. That kindness transforms enemies into family." 25 years later, in the spring of 1970, Greta Mueller-Thompson stood in the kitchen of her restaurant on South Congress Avenue in Austin, Texas. The smell of fried chicken filled the air, that same golden aroma that had changed her life a quarter-century earlier. Outside, a line of customers stretched down the block, waiting for a taste of what food critics were calling the best fried chicken in Texas. The restaurant, named Sarah's Kitchen in honor of the woman who had first taught her the recipe, had become an Austin institution. Greta had married Buck Thompson's nephew in 1948, becoming truly part of the family that had first shown her kindness. She had 3 children now, all raised on stories of transformation and second chances. On the wall behind the register hung a framed photograph from that last dinner at Camp Swift. 23 German women and a dozen American soldiers, arms around each other, smiling. Beside it hung Sarah Thompson's original recipe card, preserved under glass, the handwriting faded but still legible. Anna Weber had become Dr. Anna Weber, Chief of Nursing at Brackenridge Hospital. She visited the restaurant every Sunday, always ordering the fried chicken, always remembering. Margarete ran the Mueller family bakery in Bastrop, her German pastries as famous as Greta's chicken. Of the 15 women who returned to Germany, Greta maintained correspondence with 12. They had scattered across the rebuilt country, carrying the lessons learned in Texas. Several became teachers, determined to raise a generation that questioned, rather than blindly obeyed. One founded a German-American friendship society. Another worked with refugees, showing the same kindness she had received. That afternoon, a young reporter arrived to interview Greta for a feature story. "What would you say to people who question whether former enemy soldiers should have been allowed to stay in America?" he asked. Greta thought carefully before answering. "America's greatest strength is not its military power. It is its capacity to offer redemption to those willing to earn it. Buck Thompson and his family didn't forget we had been enemies, but they chose to see we could become something more." She gestured to the kitchen behind her. "This restaurant, this life, it all started with a simple act of kindness. Someone offered food to hungry prisoners when they could have offered nothing. That gesture said, 'You are human. You are worthy of dignity. You can change.' Do you ever regret your choice to stay?" the reporter asked. Greta smiled, thinking of her children, her grandchildren, the community that had embraced her. "Every day I wake grateful for the chance to choose. I spent my youth following orders. Here, I learned to think for myself, to take responsibility for my choices, to become more than I thought possible." As evening came and families filled the dining room, Greta returned to her kitchen. Veterans sat alongside immigrants, former enemies, sharing meals together. This was her legacy, built one plate of fried chicken at a time, proof that kindness transforms enemies into family, and that home is something you choose, not something you inherit.